The forest stretched endlessly across the Virginia hills, a deep, ancient thicket where the trees whispered with the wind. Every day, it seemed, the forest became more remote, the quiet of the wilderness growing thicker, like a blanket that covered everything in its path. But it was far from silent. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot reminded that the woods were alive. However, today, the usual sounds seemed muffled, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. In the shadow of a towering oak tree, a young deer moved cautiously. Its sleek body blended into the underbrush, its pale fur almost indistinguishable from the light filtering through the canopy. It stepped lightly, barely disturbing the quiet forest floor. This was a fawn in its prime, growing into its antlers, but still cautious and easily startled. The air was still, and the forest felt like a world on the edge of something. A sudden movement, a dark, shifting shape, cut through the stillness. The fawn froze, ears flicking in the direction of the disturbance. For a moment, it stood motionless, relying on its instincts. Then, a sharp sound shattered the calm. A rifle shot rang out, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. The fawn was struck, its body jerking violently as the bullet found its mark. A low, strangled cry escaped the animal's mouth, a sound so vulnerable that even the surrounding trees seemed to groan in sympathy. The fawn collapsed, blood soaking into the leaves beneath it. The hunters emerged from the bushes, their eyes gleaming with satisfaction. There were 3 of them, men whose presence in these woods had been unwelcome for far too long. Their faces were familiar to no one but the wildlife they hunted mercilessly. "Got him," said the tallest of the men, a gruff voice with a faint accent. He was holding a rifle, the barrel still smoking slightly from the shot. "That was too easy," another man, middle-aged with a wiry frame, chuckled. "They're getting careless out here. I reckon the forest's getting thin of game." The third man, younger and more reckless-looking, approached the fallen deer. He smirked, looking down at the animal with a twisted sense of triumph. "This one's too young. Doesn't matter, though. We'll take him anyway." As the 3 men gathered around their kill, their conversation turned to jokes and jabs about hunting. They didn't notice the figure watching them from a distance. A man in his late 40s, his rugged face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, emerged quietly from the shadows. His name was Henry, and he had worked these woods for more years than he cared to count. As a forest ranger, his job was to protect the land and the animals that called it home. His eyes, trained over the years, locked onto the men who were standing over the young deer. Henry was no stranger to the signs of illegal hunting. He had been tracking these men for days, watching them from a distance, but he knew they would be harder to catch in the act. These woods were vast, and the men were cunning. But Henry was smarter. His instincts as both a hunter and protector of the forest had made him adept at anticipating their next move. He surveyed the scene, quickly calculating his options. The men were distracted, focused on their kill, which was exactly what he needed. Taking a deep breath, Henry moved swiftly and silently, finding cover behind a thick clump of underbrush. His eyes never left the men as he plotted his next steps. He couldn't let them get away with this, not this time. The blood from the fawn was still fresh on the ground, and Henry could smell it. He knew the men wouldn't leave until they had their prize, but they had made a fatal mistake. They were too brazen. He would make sure that, for once, they would face the consequences of their actions. The moment was approaching. Henry had to act before the situation escalated further. He didn't want to engage in a direct confrontation, but he also couldn't let these men continue their reckless, illegal hunt. The sound of the younger man kicking at the deer's carcass brought Henry's attention back to the group. His heart tightened. These weren't just hunters, they were poachers, and they were desecrating the sacred balance of the land. This could not be allowed to continue. He moved silently, carefully, toward a narrow trail that wound through the trees and led to a small clearing not far from the poacher's position. There, Henry would set his plan in motion. But first, he had to check on the fawn, make sure it was still alive. He took one last look at the men, then disappeared into the forest. Henry moved quickly, his boots light against the ground as he navigated the dense underbrush. The air was thick with the scent of pine and moss, and the forest seemed to close in around him, offering both concealment and solace. He had always been at home here, but today the woods felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, as if nature itself was waiting for something. His mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand. The fawn was still alive, though barely. Henry had seen too many animals fall to poachers in his time, and he knew that if the fawn wasn't attended to immediately, it wouldn't make it through the night. It had to be brought to safety, somewhere the poachers couldn't follow. The sound of his footsteps softened as he approached the clearing where he had last seen the fawn. He took a deep breath, the quiet of the forest a stark contrast to the chaos of the situation. When he reached the spot, he knelt beside the animal. The young deer lay on its side, breathing shallowly, its eyes wide with pain and fear. Blood still seeped from the wound in its shoulder, staining the forest floor beneath it. Henry's heart sank as he gently placed a hand on the animal's head, his touch reassuring but firm. He spoke to it softly, though he knew the fawn couldn't understand him. "Easy, little one," he murmured, brushing aside a lock of tangled fur. "You're going to be all right." Henry knew he had no time to waste. The poachers might have been distracted, but they were likely still in the area. He couldn't risk them finding the fawn again, especially now that they had likely tracked it down to this very spot. He needed to get it back to his cabin, somewhere he could patch it up and give it the care it needed. He gently lifted the fawn, cradling it in his arms. The animal let out a soft whimper but didn't struggle. Its weight was surprisingly light, though Henry knew it wasn't long before the pain would overwhelm it. He needed to hurry. He moved quickly through the forest, avoiding the main trails as he knew the poachers might be patrolling them. Instead, he took a series of narrow, hidden paths that only he knew, paths that twisted and turned through the dense foliage. The forest seemed to guide him, its whispering branches and rustling leaves masking his movements as he moved deeper into the woods. After a few minutes, Henry reached a small clearing. It was here that he had set up his cabin years ago, a humble place hidden far from the eyes of others. It was the one place he could feel at peace, away from the world, away from the threats that often sought to destroy what he loved. He knew it was the only safe haven for the fawn. The cabin was modest, built with his own hands and stocked with supplies for emergencies just like this one. It was more of a shelter than a home, a refuge for the creatures of the forest when they needed it. Henry had spent countless nights here, nursing wounded animals back to health or simply offering them the peace they needed. He set the fawn down gently on the worn wooden floor of the cabin, taking a moment to assess the situation. The wound in its shoulder was serious, but it wasn't fatal. If he could stop the bleeding and get the animal some rest, there was hope. But time was of the essence. If he didn't act fast, the fawn would slip away, and it would be just another casualty of the poacher's greed. Henry moved to his medical supplies, pulling out antiseptics and bandages. He worked quickly but carefully, his hands steady as he cleaned the wound and applied a makeshift dressing. The fawn winced as he touched the tender area, but it didn't struggle. Henry murmured calming words to it, trying to keep it as still as possible. Once the wound was bandaged, he set the fawn down on a bed of soft hay he kept for such occasions. He needed to give the animal time to rest, to regain its strength. But that wasn't all. He couldn't risk leaving it alone here for too long. He had to be sure the poachers wouldn't find it again. Henry knew that, if the poachers were as experienced as he suspected, they would be back soon. They wouldn't leave the fawn unguarded for long, and if they found it, they would kill it without hesitation. Henry had to act quickly but not without caution. He needed to lure them away, to buy the fawn some time. He made a plan, a dangerous one, but one he knew might work. The day wore on as Henry prepared. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest. He moved swiftly, gathering everything he needed to put his plan into action. He had set up several decoys along the edge of the woods, using a series of carefully placed animal carcasses to distract the poachers and lead them off the fawn's trail. It was risky, but it was the only option he had. As dusk fell, Henry heard the faint crunch of footsteps. The poachers were close. He took a deep breath, his pulse quickening, and set his plan into motion. The poachers arrived at the clearing, their eyes scanning the area. They were cautious now, their previous arrogance replaced by suspicion. They knew something was off. But Henry was ready. He had already positioned himself upwind of the clearing, hidden behind a thick cluster of trees. From here, he could see everything, and the poachers couldn't see him. The men spread out, their rifles raised as they searched the forest. They muttered to each other, their voices low, trying to piece together what had happened. Henry watched them closely, noting their every movement. He knew that, sooner or later, they would realize the fawn was no longer where they had left it. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Henry watched the poachers from his hidden position. The evening sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air was thick with tension. He could hear their voices now, murmured, frustrated. They were getting close. The three poachers were spread out across the clearing, moving cautiously through the underbrush, their eyes scanning every tree, every shadow. They had already seen the blood trail from the fawn, but it had abruptly stopped, and that unnerved them. They were confused, trying to figure out where the animal had gone. "Where the hell is it?" Ed, the leader of the group, growled. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of many years in the woods. His voice carried a note of annoyance, and his sharp eyes scanned the area with the precision of a hunter who didn't miss much. "It was just here. We're not leaving until we find it." "Yeah, but the trail's gone cold," muttered the younger man, Mike, whose hair was dark and unkempt, and whose hands trembled with barely contained impatience. "You sure we didn't miss something? Maybe it's just lying low, hiding. Could have wandered off somewhere." "Don't be a fool," Ed snapped, his voice low but intense. "If it was still here, we'd have found it by now. No, something's off. Someone's been here." The third man, a wiry figure named Dave, was crouched down beside a clump of leaves, carefully studying the ground. "I think you're right, Ed. There's something strange about this. No animal just vanishes like that. Whoever's been here knows how to cover their tracks." Henry's heart sank as he heard the words. He had been expecting them to catch on, but hearing it from their mouths made it feel all too real. They were getting closer to the truth. He couldn't afford to let them figure out the decoys. If they connected the dots, they would be back on the Fawn's trail in no time. He adjusted his position, trying to stay completely still. He was well hidden behind a large cluster of bushes and a few thick tree trunks, his eyes locked onto the poachers as they continued to search. Henry had to think quickly. The decoys would buy him a little time, but not much. Ed was growing more agitated. His heavy boots crushed the forest floor with each step, and his eyes were constantly darting from side to side, looking for any signs of movement. "We're wasting time here," he muttered, turning toward his companions. "We need to split up. I'll take the east side. Mike, you head west. Dave, you stay in the center and keep your eyes peeled. And if you see anyone, you shoot first. Ask questions later. Got it?" The men nodded, and Henry's blood ran cold as they began to disperse. The risk had just increased tenfold. They were searching in earnest now, and if one of them came too close, there was a real chance they would stumble upon his position. Worse still, if they found the cabin, they would know exactly where the Fawn was. He couldn't wait any longer. Henry made his decision. He would have to confront them. It didn't take long for the poachers to spread out, each one moving with practiced stealth. Ed had taken the east side, which meant he was heading toward the area Henry had left unguarded. Mike was moving west, which put him in the opposite direction. That left Dave, the most meticulous of the three, right in the middle, closer to the clearing and the decoys Henry had set up. Henry's mind raced as he formulated a plan. He had one shot, one opportunity to outsmart them, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. He checked his rifle, making sure it was ready, but he didn't intend to use it unless absolutely necessary. His priority was to get the poachers away from the Fawn, and to do that, he needed to lead them in the wrong direction. He had already set up a trail leading to the east where Ed was heading. It would appear to the poachers as if the Fawn had escaped that way, and Henry hoped that would be enough to lure them away from the Fawn's true location. With a steady breath, Henry slipped through the trees, moving silently toward the area where he had planned to mislead them. He knew that once he made his move, there would be no turning back. The poachers were smart, and they wouldn't be easily fooled. Meanwhile, Dave continued to search the center of the clearing, his eyes narrowing as he carefully examined the ground. He had come across the faintest trace of blood. Nothing substantial, but enough to pique his curiosity. He crouched lower, brushing aside the leaves to get a better look. The faintest sound reached his ears, a rustling in the distance. It wasn't the wind. His instincts told him someone, or something, was there. Slowly he reached for his rifle, his eyes scanning the trees. Henry froze. Dave's sharp senses had detected something. He couldn't risk being discovered. He had to make a choice. As quietly as he could, he moved further away from the clearing, hoping to get a better vantage point without being seen. The last thing he wanted was to get into a confrontation, at least not yet. He needed them to believe the Fawn was heading east, and then he would lead them off completely. As Ed and Mike continued to comb the forest, their frustration mounted. The forest, with its dense underbrush and scattered trees, was an ideal hiding spot for animals. But it was also a challenge for humans to track them without making noise. It was almost as if the forest itself had conspired to keep its secrets. Nothing at all," Mike muttered angrily, his voice barely more than a whisper as he pushed through a thicket. "I swear this place is cursed." Ed turned to him with a grim look. "Keep looking. We're not leaving until we find that damn deer." Henry watched the scene unfold from the shadows. He could hear their growing frustration, their voices drifting closer. It was time. He carefully stepped out into the open and made a deliberate noise, rustling some leaves in the direction of the east. Ed was the first to react. He turned sharply, narrowing his eyes. What was that? The sudden rustling in the brush caught Ed's attention immediately. His instincts kicked in, honed by years of hunting and tracking, and his eyes narrowed as he scanned the woods around him. The others stopped in their tracks, their eyes turning toward him. What was that? Mike asked, his voice tense. I don't know, Ed muttered, raising his rifle slightly, scanning the shadows, but it came from that direction. He pointed eastward, toward the decoy trail Henry had set up. Stay alert. It could be the deer, or whoever's been messing with us. The three men began moving cautiously toward the sound. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he watched them approach. They were moving in the wrong direction, but they weren't completely fooled yet. They would still be suspicious. He had to make sure they stayed on their false trail. He stepped back further into the shadows, staying as silent as possible. His plan was working, but he couldn't relax just yet. The poachers were close, and he still had to keep them distracted long enough for the fawn to be safe. Meanwhile, the fawn was resting in the cabin, still oblivious to the danger lurking outside. Henry had done all he could to stabilize the animal, and now it was up to time and nature to do the rest. The fawn's breathing had slowed, and the wound in its shoulder was no longer bleeding heavily. But Henry knew the danger wasn't over. The poachers would eventually realize they had been led away from the real trail, and they would double back, looking for the fawn. As the poachers moved further east, Henry's mind raced with contingency plans. He had always been good at thinking on his feet, but this situation was more complicated than anything he had faced before. The poachers weren't ordinary hunters. They were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The sounds of their movements were growing fainter as they approached the decoys. Henry allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but only a moment. He still had to get the fawn to safety, and that meant keeping the poachers far away from the clearing. Back in the forest, the poachers were on high alert as they approached the spot where Henry had placed the decoy. Mike, who was at the rear, was getting more and more agitated. This is all wrong, Ed. The trail just ends. There's nothing here. Just some old animal carcasses. Ed grunted in frustration. Keep looking. Something's going on here. There's no way this deer just vanished into thin air. Dave, who had been leading the way, stopped suddenly. Wait a minute, he said, crouching down. Look at this. He pointed to a few disturbed leaves and a fresh trail of blood that led deeper into the woods. This is fresh. It's gotta be the deer. The poachers froze, the realization dawning on them. We were on the wrong trail, Ed muttered, a curse slipping from his lips. Someone's been playing us. They've been guiding us away from the real one. Dave nodded grimly. That's exactly what happened. Whoever did this is good. Too good. Henry gritted his teeth in frustration, hearing their words. He knew they were getting closer to the truth. If they followed the trail now, they would eventually come back to the fawn's location. He couldn't let that happen. He needed to take this final step to throw them off completely. The three men turned back toward the clearing, their eyes darting to the surroundings. They were more cautious now, realizing the seriousness of the situation. Henry was still behind them, watching closely from the cover of thick foliage. His pulse raced, and his hand tightened on the grip of his rifle. He had one more chance to lead them astray. He took a deep breath and made his move. With careful precision, Henry moved silently across the forest floor, heading north, back toward the trail the poachers had been on earlier. He moved as swiftly as he dared, knowing that if he made a mistake now, it would be over. The poachers would catch on and be back on the fawn's trail before he could stop them. Ed was the first to notice the movement. There! He shouted, raising his rifle and pointing in Henry's direction. Someone's there! Mike and Dave immediately followed Ed's lead, their rifles raised as they turned toward the source of the movement. But Henry had already anticipated their reaction. With a quick motion, he fired a warning shot into the air, the loud crack of the rifle echoing through the woods. The poachers ducked instinctively, startled by the sound. It's him! Ed barked, his eyes locked on Henry's position. He's leading us in circles! We've got to stop him! Henry didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, darting through the trees, keeping low to the ground. His heart was pounding in his chest as he wove between the thick trunks and underbrush. Behind him, the poachers were hot on his trail, their shouts and crashing footsteps growing louder. The chase was on. Henry pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his legs as he navigated the dense forest. He knew these woods better than anyone, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. He darted left, then right, doubling back in a zigzag pattern, hoping to confuse the poachers. But they were relentless. The sound of their pursuit was growing louder with each passing moment. He had to get them as far away from the fawn as possible. Henry reached a ridge overlooking a steep ravine. He skidded to a halt, eyes scanning the terrain below. It was a risky move, but he had no choice. He could hear the poachers closing in fast. With no other option, he made a split-second decision. Without looking back, he leapt into the ravine, hoping to lose the poachers below. The poachers were close now, but when they reached the ridge, they found nothing but empty space. Ed cursed loudly, peering over the edge. "Damn it! He jumped! We lost him!" Mike, panting and out of breath, scanned the landscape. "He's gone. We'll never catch him now." Ed gritted his teeth, frustration evident in his face. "We'll find him. But first, we're going back to the clearing. I'm not leaving until we find that deer." Henry's heart raced as he scrambled down the steep ravine. His boots slipped on the loose soil, but he managed to keep his balance. The loud shouts of the poachers echoed from above, their frustration palpable. They were not far behind, but Henry knew this landscape better than they ever could. He had spent years patrolling these woods, learning the hidden paths and secret shortcuts. He trusted the forest now as much as he trusted his own instincts. As he reached the bottom of the ravine, Henry stopped for a brief moment to catch his breath. The sound of the poachers' pursuit was distant now, but he couldn't afford to relax, not yet. The fawn, still recovering in the cabin, was depending on him. Every second counted. He had to keep the poachers away long enough for the fawn to heal. Without hesitation, Henry started moving again, climbing up the opposite slope, using the rocks and branches to pull himself up. He had one goal: to get back to the cabin, ensure the fawn was safe, and get it back to the wild before the poachers could track him down again. He moved swiftly and quietly through the dense forest, careful not to make too much noise. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself, but with each step, he could feel the weight of the danger growing heavier. The poachers were no fools. They would be relentless in their pursuit. Back at the clearing, the poachers were regrouping. Their frustration had reached a boiling point. Ed, the leader of the group, was scanning the forest with narrowed eyes, his fingers twitching around his rifle. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered. "We were so close, and now he's got the drop on us. That bastard knows these woods like the back of his hand." Mike was pacing in circles, his energy running out. "We've been chasing him for hours. We're not going to catch him at this rate." Dave, however, was still focused. "We can't give up now. He's got the deer, and we're not leaving until we find it. We'll circle back. There's got to be a way to track him down. He can't hide forever." Ed gave a reluctant nod. "All right. We'll go back to the clearing. We'll search again. But this time we're not letting him get away." The three poachers began retracing their steps, heading back toward the cabin. The hunt was far from over. They had a job to do, and they weren't about to leave until they had what they came for. Meanwhile, Henry had reached the cabin. His muscles burned from the exertion, but the sight of the small building in the clearing gave him a sense of relief. He had made it back. The fawn was still inside, lying on the bed of hay, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Henry crouched down beside it and gently stroked its head, whispering comforting words. "You're doing well, little one. Just a little longer, and you'll be free." He knew the fawn was still weak, but it had come a long way since the night he found it. The bleeding had stopped, and its breathing had become steady again. The rest would do it good. But it was time to act. The poachers weren't far behind, and if they found the cabin now, it would be all over. Henry quickly packed up the essentials: some food, water, a first aid kit, and a blanket. He was going to get the fawn back to its herd, no matter what it took. He carefully lifted the animal in his arms, making sure to support its injured shoulder. The fawn nuzzled against him, calm and trusting. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The journey back would be dangerous, and the poachers weren't far behind. But he had no choice. The forest was calling him, and he couldn't let the fawn remain in danger. The poachers were closing in, and Henry could feel the tension in the air as he made his way deeper into the forest. The trees around him grew taller and thicker, the shadows of the evening stretching long. It was getting darker now, and the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Henry knew the poachers were getting closer. Their voices were faint but still audible, carried by the wind. He had to stay ahead of them. The path was becoming more treacherous, but Henry was determined. He couldn't risk losing the fawn now, not after everything he had done to save it. As he walked, he could feel the fawn's small body trembling slightly, but it stayed quiet, trusting him to guide it back to safety. Henry spoke to it softly, trying to comfort it, though he knew the danger was far from over. The poachers, meanwhile, were growing more desperate. They had lost Henry's trail several times, but each time they picked it up again, their anger and determination only grew. They knew they were close. "We're almost there," Ed said, his voice low and harsh. "Keep your eyes peeled. He can't have gotten far." Dave nodded, scanning the ground for any signs of movement. "He's clever, but he won't be able to keep this up for much longer." Mike's voice came from behind them. "Look!" He pointed ahead, his eyes narrowing. "There, a set of fresh tracks. He's been here." The poachers immediately followed the tracks, their determination fueling their every step. They were closing in on their prey. Henry could hear the voices now, closer than before. His heart raced as he pushed through the dense forest. He couldn't let them catch up. He had to get to the fawn's herd. It wasn't far. The thought of returning the animal to its family was the only thing that kept him moving. He reached a clearing and paused, scanning the area. He had to be sure he wasn't being followed. The last thing he wanted was for the poachers to catch sight of him. Through the trees, he spotted it. The herd. The fawn's family. He could see them grazing quietly in the distance. Henry's heart leapt with relief. The fawn would be safe here. The danger was nearly over. At the same time, the poachers were just a few hundred yards away. They had found the trail again, and they were closing in fast, but they weren't prepared for what they would find next. The herd was just ahead. Henry moved slowly, careful not to disturb the peace of the group. The fawn in his arms had grown heavier as they made their way deeper into the forest, but the familiar sounds of its family grazing brought a sense of peace to Henry's mind. He could already see the dark outlines of the other deer, their long necks bending low as they fed on the fresh grass. In the distance, he could hear the soft snorts and rustling of leaves as the herd moved through the clearing. The fawn's ears twitched, and for the first time since its injury, it seemed to lift its head. It looked towards the other deer, its body trembling slightly. Henry could feel the tension in its muscles, but he could also feel the animal's instincts guiding it forward. The fawn was ready. It was time for it to return to its rightful place. Henry lowered the fawn gently onto the ground. It took a few hesitant steps toward the herd, its legs wobbling slightly beneath it, but its determination was evident. The other deer had noticed the newcomer, and for a moment, they all stopped grazing, watching the fawn closely. Henry held his breath, his eyes scanning the trees around him. The poachers were still out there, and they were closing in fast. The poachers had found the trail again. Their pursuit was relentless, and they were now only a few minutes away from the clearing. Ed led the way, his eyes searching the woods with the sharp intensity of a man who was close to his prize. His grip on the rifle tightened, ready for anything that came into view. "Stay alert," Ed muttered. "We're almost there." Mike and Dave nodded, both of them struggling to keep up. Their fatigue was starting to show, but their determination burned hot. They knew Henry was getting close to the herd, and if they didn't catch him now, they would lose him for good. As they approached the clearing, they slowed down. Ed raised a hand, signaling the others to stop. He crouched down, his eyes darting to the movement in the distance. Through the trees, he could see the herd grazing quietly, and in the middle of them, the fawn, the one they had been chasing for hours, was standing, hesitant but determined. "This is it," Ed whispered. "He's with them." The poachers moved into position, ready to strike. They had no intention of letting the fawn escape again. They would take it, no matter the cost. Henry had been watching the herd, his heart beating loudly in his chest. The fawn was close now, just a few steps away from rejoining its family. But then, he heard it. An unmistakable crack of a twig behind him. The sound was faint, but it was enough. He knew what it meant. The poachers were here. In that moment, everything seemed to stop. The peaceful hum of the forest faded into a tense silence, broken only by the approaching footsteps of the men. Henry stood still for a moment, weighing his options. The fawn was almost home. The herd was right there, and the poachers wouldn't let them escape easily. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the trees. In the distance, through the dense foliage, he could see the outlines of the poachers. Ed and Mike, their rifles raised, eyes locked onto the fawn. Without thinking, Henry moved quickly to intercept them, taking a sharp step forward. The poachers hadn't seen him yet, and he knew he had one chance to stop them before they could reach the herd. "Stay back," Henry called, his voice firm. "You won't get another shot." The poachers stopped in their tracks, startled by the sudden appearance of the forest ranger. Ed's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, rifle at the ready. "You're making a mistake, Ranger," Ed growled. "That deer's ours. You've been interfering with our hunt for too long." Henry stood his ground, his body tense but resolute. I won't let you harm that animal, he said, his voice low and unwavering. Not while I'm here. Mike sneered. What do you think you're going to do? Stop us? I'll do whatever it takes, Henry replied, his eyes flicking to the herd behind him. The fawn was now standing among the other deer, its legs more stable. It was almost safe. You're done here. Turn around and leave before things get ugly. Ed gritted his teeth. He was used to getting what he wanted, and this man, this ranger, wasn't going to stop him. With a sharp motion, he raised his rifle, pointing it at Henry. I told you, Ranger, Ed spat, his voice cold. We don't back down. This is our kill. Henry knew what was coming. He could see it in Ed's eyes. He wasn't going to back off. But Henry wasn't about to let him take another step toward the fawn. His hand moved quickly to his own rifle, but just as he was about to raise it, there was a sudden deafening crack from the trees above. The poachers froze. A loud, deep growl echoed from the woods, and in an instant, a massive figure appeared from the shadows. A bear, its fur bristling as it moved forward with terrifying speed. The poachers shouted in surprise, scrambling back, their eyes wide with fear. The bear was enormous, its jaws snapping as it bared its teeth. Henry didn't hesitate. He knew the danger. The poachers were distracted, and the moment the bear appeared, Henry took the opportunity to pull the fawn back toward the herd. He shouted to them, urging them to move. Go, Henry yelled. Get back to the woods now. The fawn, startled but not afraid, bolted toward the other deer. The herd, sensing the danger, began to move swiftly, disappearing into the trees as the bear roared. The poachers, in their panic, turned and fled. Ed and Mike ran for their lives, their rifles forgotten in the chaos. The bear gave chase for a moment, but soon it lost interest, retreating back into the forest with a final roar. Henry stood still, watching the fawn and its family disappear into the trees. His heart raced, but he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The danger had passed. The poachers were gone, the fawn was safe, and the forest had once again regained its peace. Henry stood there, alone in the clearing, his rifle at his side. The forest around him seemed to exhale, the tension lifting as the last echoes of the poachers' shouts faded away. He had done it. He had saved the fawn. And as he turned back to the trees, he knew the forest would continue, its rhythms unchanged. There would always be threats, always dangers lurking in the shadows. But there would also be protectors like him, ready to stand between the wild and those who sought to destroy it. With a final glance back at the disappearing herd, Henry stepped into the woods, the cool air of the evening settling around him. The forest had won today.